Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second Lorana Sullivan Lecture. I'm Sheila Coronel. I am Dean of Academic Affairs at the Journalism School and also Director of the Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism. It's my honor to do the introductions this evening. Lorana Sullivan is a distinguished alumna of the Journalism School. She graduated here in 1964. She was a pioneer in investigative financial journalism. She also opened the door to women reporters who covered the then and still very much male world of finance, where she started out at the Wall Street Journal, where she worked with some of the finest journalists and editors such as Jonathan Whitney and Stanley Penn. She investigated the then new frontier of offshore crookery, as well as an old Wall Street Journal an old Wall Street problem, which is organized crime and its links to business. Lorana led the way in financial journalism when she moved to London, first with the Sunday Times and then the Observer. She was the first person to spot what became the world's biggest ever bank fraud, then at least, the Bank of Credit and Commercial International, or BCCI. Maybe many of you are too young to remember the BCCI scandal, but it was big. Well before regulators were looking into the problem, and well before other reporters had spotted it, Lorana was already there. She also investigated the mafia-linked boiler room scams of the 1980s in a series of investment and tax frauds, both big and small. Lorana was able to do all of this because she had mastery of minute detail and an insatiable appetite for financial documents. Those days before the internet and before online databases, that meant obtaining and reading through hundreds, if not thousands, of hard copy documents. That forensic skill enabled her to find her way through a jungle of company names and numbers that would have defeated those less determined. Lorana was a great fan of our journalism school and what it stands for. She was determined to enable others to share the opportunity she had, and by doing so, also raise the bar for business journalism, especially when it comes to those investigating financial power and holding financial power accountable. She also wanted more women to follow in her path. The Lorana Sullivan Foundation created the full scholarship program in her name here at the Journalism School. So far, that program has enabled more than 20 students from around the world to benefit from an education here at the Columbia. So far, more than $1 million has been given in scholarships to students. Because of her love of corporate detail, Lorana would have been delighted to hear our speaker tonight. I have the pleasure of introducing Bethany McLean, who is here with us. She is currently a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. She's not a Columbia graduate, but we don't take that against her. She graduated from Williams College in 1992 with a double major in math and English, and spent the next 3 years working as an investment banker at Goldman Sachs. Then she moved over to the opposite of the dark side, I guess. She moved over to our side. In 1995, she joined Fortune magazine as a reporter and eventually became editor-at-large there. Her well-known 2001 magazine piece for Fortune is Enron Overpriced, was one of the first skeptical, if not the first skeptical article written about Enron. And after that, the company collapsed into bankruptcy. She also co-authored Smartest Guys in the Room, The Amazing Rise and Scandalous Fall of Enron, with her Fortune colleague, Peter Elkin. A documentary based on the book was nominated for an Oscar in 2006. In 2008, Bethany joined Vanity Fair as a contributing editor, and in 2010, she co-authored with New York Times columnist Joan Nocera, All the Devil's Here, The Hidden History of the Financial Crisis. Bethany is currently still with Fortune, but as a columnist for Fortune.com. Her latest book, copies of which we're selling at the other side of the room, is called Shaky Ground, The Strange Saga of U.S. mortgage giants. It's about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Bethany will talk to us tonight about what she's learned in her many years of doing financial investigative journalism. Welcome Bethany McLean, our second Lorana Sullivan Lecturer.
Thank you so much, and welcome everybody. I sometimes joke when I'm speaking that I'm actually the opposite of a motivational speaker, because instead of talking about good people doing things right, I've sort of accidentally made a career of chronicling things that have gone wrong. In fact, though, I'm a somewhat accidental journalist, and so I thought instead of zeroing in on one aspect of investigative journalism, I would talk about my career more broadly and some of the lessons that I've learned from actually almost 2 decades of doing this. So I grew up in northern Minnesota in a small mining town that is best known because it's the home of Bob Dylan. And I didn't know any journalists when I was growing up. We had a local paper called the Hibbing Daily Tribune, but it frankly wasn't part of my life. My parents didn't believe in TV, so we didn't have one of those either, so I didn't even get exposure to TV journalism. My parents were resolutely practical. Their primary goal in life was being able to support yourself, and journalism wasn't included in that list of fields in which one could support oneself. So it probably explains how I became a math and an English major in college, or perhaps it's just the sign of a confused brain. But during my college years, I was confused about what I wanted to do. I was not one of those people with a grand plan. I didn't work for the college paper. My math major, as it does for some people, turned very hard around my junior year, and I knew that I did not want to go on to math graduate school. So I was in the career counseling office one night, and I couldn't get my cover letter to print out on a single page, which you had to do to attach a cover letter to your resume. So I decided the only jobs I would apply for would be those that didn't require a cover letter. So I could just stick my resume in the file, which is how I ended up being a young investment banker at Goldman Sachs. We didn't have investment banks in northern Minnesota either. We had the local merchant and miners bank was as close as I understood to what banking was. So there I ended up at Goldman Sachs with my mother clipping articles out of the paper about mergers and acquisitions that had taken place and sending them in the mail to me, so that I might have some idea of what was going on. But I did learn during my years at Goldman, and I'm going to come back to these things, a few things that I have come to consider pretty critical to journalism. One thing I learned at Goldman was how not to be intimidated. From a very early time there, I had to make calls to CEOs or give a presentation by myself in front of a room, and I learned very, very quickly how to get past my feeling of fear or intimidation. And for me, that was a very important lesson as a kid from a small town. The second thing I learned, which I think is also really important to journalism, is how to tackle something when you don't know how to start. There were many nights, late nights at Goldman Sachs, where you wouldn't have slept for 24 hours, and you'd have some sort of project that had to be on the senior person's desk by the morning, and there'd be nobody around to show you how to do it or to help you through it, and you had to figure it out. And I think a lot of that is true about journalism as well. There's often no roadmap for how to do a story, and what works for one story may not work for the next one. So you have to figure it out. And the third thing I learned very painfully, I must admit, one of my least favorite episodes at Goldman was when a senior person got so angry at me, he actually took his shoe off and threw it at me because I had made a mistake in calculating the compound annual growth rates of the ice cream industry. And I thought, this is what my life has come down to. But I did learn how to be very meticulous about the little things and about the details. And I'm going to come back to that as well, because I think that's another thing that is overlooked, but is really critical to journalism. So anyway, I got to Fortune and found myself in a bit of a pickle when I arrived at the magazine, because I really didn't know how to write. If I had ever known how to write, I think 3 years of putting together what we used to refer to as GSBS had taken it out of me. I actually even had an editor pull me over at one point and say, I think you should think about doing something else. The knock on me was that I was debatably smart, but completely unable to write. So the only way for me to get in the magazine was to tackle the stories that other people didn't want to do. And at that point in time, covering personal finance was a bit of a backwater. It was literally put at the back of the book, the back of the magazine. And nobody wanted to do personal finance stories. I was assigned to do a column called Companies to Watch, where I was supposed to pick every 2 weeks, which was Fortune's publication schedule, 3 stocks that were going to double or triple or quadruple in value in, the next 6 months. And for those of you in the audience who know something about business, you're thinking, that's really difficult. But it actually wasn't. It was shockingly easy. There were no shortage of people coming by Fortune, be they analysts who covered the stock, mutual fund managers who owned the stock, corporate executives who would lay out for me these great little stories of these companies that were going to double or triple or quadruple in value. And I would dutifully write them up, and the stories would be really good. I mean, they were really snazzy little stories. And then I'd watch in horror as the stock usually went in exactly the opposite direction. So I learned a lot from this, not because I was good at it. I actually shudder to think about the people who might have taken my investing advice, but because I was so bad at it. And it was the growth of what I like to think of my skepticism rather than my cynicism, that you can't always believe what you're told, that the story someone is selling to you, they're sometimes selling to you for a reason, and that might not have anything to do with what the truth is. And that Wall Street and the business world really is sort of appropriate for where I grew up, like Lake Wobegon. Everything is great, and everything is wonderful, and everything is a buy, until that is, it's not. So I started to try to work on getting to know skeptics, people who would give me the other side of the story, short sellers, and it's very, very hard to find those types of people. It's unlike business journalism is unlike political reporting in that way. In political reporting, there often are 2 sides of the story, and you can find people on both sides of the story. Business is very difficult because everyone is motivated and incentivized to be positive, to be part of the buy machine, and so finding the people who are not is tricky. And I was always, when I found these people, stunned by the amount of homework they'd done and the knowledge they seemed to have. So during this, I met a guy named Jim Chanos, a hedge fund manager, and in the fall of 2000, Jim asked me, "So have you taken a close look at Enron? Have you thought about how Enron makes its money?" And he was very amused because Fortune had actually named Enron its most innovative company for the previous 6 years running on its most admired list. And I like to joke that Enron actually was the most innovative company in corporate America. And even almost 2 decades later, I would still stand by that. So I wrote this story, which in retrospect should win headlines for the meekest title ever, which was "Is Enron Overpriced?" And it became a really seminal moment in my career. There was obviously a lot of luck involved in that, and I want to return to that. But I thought I would talk about my top 10 lessons from my 20 years of doing this, and hopefully some of them will resonate with some of you. So one thing that jumps out at me from my own story is that there's really no right background for a journalist. I actually wish I had gone to journalism school. I think I would have learned a lot of things and hopefully not have had this knock against me that I couldn't write. Hopefully journalism school would have taught me that so I didn't have to learn at Fortune. But there is no right background for a journalist. It's a job in which a lot of interesting things from your background, from your own unique path can come into play. Despite my unconventional background for journalism and lack of planning, it turned out I was exactly the right person to write about Enron because I knew how to analyze financial statements. I knew how to dig into numbers. I wasn't intimidated. And so these aspects from my somewhat random, unplanned background turned out to be exactly right for this moment and in this story. I think one thing you do have to have as a journalist is curiosity. And it's interesting because I've always gotten the question in the years since writing about Enron, well, how are you going to find the next one? How do you find the next big story? And I've always said, I don't think about that way. When I wrote about Enron, I didn't think this is going to be the story that changes my career, shapes my career. This is it for me. If I had, I would have been terrified. I just thought this is really interesting. Here's this company. Its financial statements don't make a lot of sense. Nobody can explain the business to me in a way that makes sense. The company is evasive at best. There's a story here, and that's how I try to think about most things. And I think one of the great things about being a journalist is just learning how to harness your own curiosity. It's an incredibly valuable thing in life as well as in journalism. If you aren't really interested, just dying to know the answer, you won't make that extra phone call or read that extra document that sometimes results in finding something that feels like serendipity, but is really just a result of digging and digging and digging. So I loved the line from Sheila's introduction about Lorena, this insatiable appetite for financial documents. I think, frightening as it sounds, I have an insatiable appetite for financial documents. I found one example when I was going through I think it was over 1,000 pages of dense material from one of the congressional committees investigating the aftermath of the financial crisis. And in my book, All the Devils Are Here, we had told a story about this company called Guardian, this very sleazy company that really helped start the subprime mortgage boom that was run by these entrepreneurs who made millions and ended up in prison. It was a great story, but there, buried in the documents from a supervisor of these guys, was a line in 2008, one regulator writing to another, "Ground zero, baby." Guardian was ground zero. And that's just a perfect thing to help pull together why you're talking about this company. Anyway, so another thing about journalism is that there's also no real career path, no established career path. That's really true today, but it was even true when I started in journalism 20 years ago. I remember being shocked because in investment banking, you worked for 2 years as an analyst, you went to business school, you worked for 4 years as an associate, you worked for 4 years as a vice president, law school, medical school. All these things have a very prescribed career path. Journalism, there is really no such thing. It doesn't even necessarily matter where you went to school. It's sort of a take on what your mother used to tell you. You are what you eat. In this case, you are what you write, or you are what you produce. I mean, it's kind of scary because I think luck plays a role and there's no clear-cut path, but it's also pretty great because luck plays a role and there's no clear-cut path. If you had told me in my younger years that I would have one day ended up writing for Vanity Fair, I would have said that was never part of the plan. I wouldn't have seen the path to that. I'm not sure, standing here today, what it is that I'll do next. I just finished doing this book, Shaky Ground, for Columbia, and I'm looking for new projects, but the world of journalism is in flux right now, and I try to, in my better moments, see that as opportunity instead of just as scary. So another lesson for me, in my first year at Fortune, when I was there, I was fact-checking a story, and I had to make some really difficult phone calls where I had to call people and say, we're saying this about you. Do you want to comment? And I thought, I don't like this. And I went to my editor at the time, a guy named John Curran, and I said, you know what? I'm not cut out for journalism. I don't like making these phone calls. I'm scared to pick up the phone. I don't enjoy confronting people. And he said to me, Bethany, it doesn't matter if you like it or not. What matters is if you do it. And I think it was very telling for me because I think a lot of journalists have some degree of phone fear, some degree of a fear of confrontation. And I always think about it, it doesn't matter if you don't like it. What matters if you do it. That doesn't disqualify you from being an investigative journalist. What disqualifies you is if you don't do it, not whether you like it or not. And so for me, when I'm facing a particularly difficult phone call, I sometimes reduce things to the binary. I think, okay, I have two options here. Either I make the call or I don't make the call. Do I like what happens if I don't make the call? Well, no, I don't. So I'm going to make the call. And that's a helpful way for me to get through my fear. I also think that the thrill when someone does agree to talk to you, someone unexpected, and you can sit down and you can really dig in over a couple-hour conversation about what they actually thought and what they were doing, is just one of the best things. To hear somebody else's story is a thrill like no other. I was thinking, I was actually at a memorial service for a famous agent yesterday, and someone who was up on stage said about him, he used to say to his conductors, "I don't care if you like it, do you love it?" I often think that's a very good lesson. So a little bit of a corollary for me. I remember hearing in my younger years as a journalist about, I think it was at Forbes, where people would, as a badge of honor, put up on their door negative responses they'd gotten from people to their stories, or angry letters from corporate executives, and this was a badge of honor. And I remember a phrase that I heard from another editor about breaking the glass, the moment when you make that phone call that's going to get everybody really mad. And I don't have it in me to be confrontational. Maybe I grew up in northern Minnesota. I'm Minnesota nice. There's something to that. So I don't get any thrill out of those moments and out of the nasty pushback and the hateful words that come. But I do. Where I found my strength as a journalist is in my math major. Oddly enough, my logic. For me, I can't stand it when B doesn't follow A. I think being a math major was all about doing proofs, and they had to be extremely logical. And I can't stand it if something doesn't make sense. And so then I will be confrontational, and I will push, and I will continue to push, because it just deeply bothers me and offends me that I can't get an answer and I can't make things make sense. So that's how I found my strength. But I think it's important, because being confrontational may not come naturally to a lot of people, and that doesn't disqualify you from investigation. You just have to figure out what your strength is, what your thing is that will make you continue to push. So it's funny, I was out in San Diego talking to a professor. This was a couple of years ago, and I said, I think I've learned to be much more of a writer than I used to be. And he looked at me and he said, "I can tell you write like a math major." So I'm not sure that was a compliment or not, but anyway. So another lesson I learned when I started to work on my Enron book, I worked with a guy named Peter Elkind, Peter's about 15 years older than I am. He was a senior investigative journalist, and I thought, this is great. I'm going to learn how it's done. I'm going to learn all the shortcuts for how you get people to talk to you and how you do a really complicated story. And this is great. And what I learned is that actually there are no shortcuts. You talk to everybody you can think of, everyone who might talk to you. You don't handicap the chances of someone calling you back, because you actually don't have any idea who it is who might call you back, and who it is who won't. You talk to people who have talked to others and whose names have been everywhere in the press, because you might be able to get that little something more out of them that somebody else hasn't gotten. You might see the connection in something they say to something somebody else said. And you look at everything, every document that you can find. You read the footnotes. You go through everything in excruciating detail, and that's how you find things. One of my wonky little discoveries when I was researching my last book on the financial crisis was in something Angelo Mozillo, then the CEO of Countrywide, said, and it was in a note he sent complaining about the toxic mortgages that Countrywide was underwriting in 2006. And he said something along the lines of, 60% of our mortgages are used for cash-out refinancings anyway. And that sent me on this whole odyssey that has led me to feel like the financial crisis has been radically misinterpreted as being about having put people in homes who can't afford them and having been a referendum on home ownership. And it really wasn't. Most of the risky mortgages that helped create the financial crisis were these cash-out refinancings, where you get a mortgage bigger than the one you had before and use the difference in cash, and take the difference in cash and use it to pay medical bills, maybe to go on vacation, maybe to refurbish your house. But it's a story of a credit-driven economy rather than and of what happens when people get too much credit rather than a home ownership story. Anyway, a little side note here that I wanted to talk about and come back to is the importance of fact-checking. That's how I got my first job at Fortune, and there was nothing even remotely glamorous about it. You'd have to get well-known people on the phone and say things like, "Is your car blue? Is it really blue? Can we call it sky blue?" But back then, that was the way in the door, and you could prove yourself there, and maybe you'd be allowed to start writing. I got my job in 1995. It was just as the last golden age of magazine business journalism, fueled by heavy spending .com companies, was beginning. Time Inc., which owned Fortune, still owns Fortune, was itself just transitioning into the modern world. I remember hearing, and this actually isn't fact-checked, that only recently had the drink carts, pushed by white-gloved waiters, stopped rolling through the halls on closing days. But as a fact-checker, you weren't just responsible for the facts in the story as the car blew. You were responsible for the entire gist of the story, that the writer's point of view had to be accurate. I remember being given my first story to check. I vaguely remember it was something about mutual fund products, and it was written by a freelancer. It sounded really good. It was really well written, and then I started checking the facts, and they were all wrong. I remember just this shock of discovery that nothing this person had written was right. And up until that point, words on the page in their unambiguous black and white had always conveyed such authority to me that I didn't question them. I never read that way again. And an editor said to me once that good writers are really dangerous because you can be so seduced by their writing that you simply drink in these unsupported leaps of logic. I think by the 2000s, this sort of art of fact-checking was dying. I don't even think it was about the money at first. It was just about the time. Who could afford to sit on a story for weeks while it got fact-checked? But I think something has been lost, and it's an important something to reclaim if you're going to go down the path of investigative journalism. It's good to learn skepticism about other people's words. It's good to learn that facts can be very slippery little creatures. It's good to learn how you yourself, even if you know the facts and reported them yourself, can contort them when you're writing because, well, the story seems better that way. And you may not even notice you're doing it because your narrative instincts are starting to rule. But it matters. If you make a mistake on the numbers, if you make a basic mistake, it impacts your credibility. People notice whether you're careful or not. And so this is they notice when you call for help on the next story, they notice if you were careful on the last one. So even though it doesn't seem always worth the time in today's speedy world, it is worth the time. Take the time to get the details right. So I think one of the biggest questions I often get is how to structure a long piece, how to structure a book. And once again, I'm going to give you a really bad answer, which is that there's no easy way to do it. There's no formula. I remember a senior woman at Fortune saying to me once, she had just turned in a piece to the editors and they hated it and said it was terrible. And she said, well, that's the great thing about this job. It will never get boring because I'll never be able to say, I know how to do it. I can phone that one in, or I've got the template for this. There's never a template, and so every story is its own. Finding the arc of it is its own process, and what worked the last time around may not work this time around. So for me, I view creating a story as starting from a lump of clay, and the lump of clay is my reporting, and I slowly carve out of that in order to find the narrative that works. But I know, and I do that by outlining extensively and by trying to outline and find my path or find the shape of my story through my lump of clay that way. I know people who just sit down and write. They don't need to outline, and I guess that's to say there's no one right way to do this. It's what works for you. What's your own individual method of finding a story. What I do think, I remember turning in a story to my editor, or a chapter of my Enron book, to the guy who was editing it, Joe Nocera, who I co-authored my second book with, and I think is one of the best editors of long-form business journalism there is. And Joe said, it doesn't move. It's just static. It doesn't move. And I thought about what that meant, and I think I understand it now, which is that in a really good piece of writing, you want it to have almost a gravitational pull that pulls you through the story. It moves. There's movement. It starts somewhere and it ends somewhere else. And you can start to feel that if something is just a static piece of analysis that doesn't go anywhere, or if it has movement in it. A corollary to this is that I think writing is an iterative process. You sit down to write, and what you first thought might be the structure doesn't work, and you have to figure it out again as you go. But I think also the process of getting toward clarity, which to me is what's critical in investigative business journalism and the most difficult thing to get at, just those simple, clear sentences. They're really, really, really hard. And they're iterative for me. I've taken to telling sources when I'm working on a story that I think I understand this, but I'm going to promise you that when I sit down to write, I'm not going to understand it, and I'm going to need to call you back. And I feel like the process, the movement between writing and reporting is also iterative. You report, you think you understand, you sit down to write, you realize you don't understand. You have to report some more as you try to drive toward clarity and toward being able to write that sentence, that one crystal clear sentence that sums it up, that is very, very hard to tell. And which, by the way, I can't always do. Remember, an editor of mine at Fortune said to me, well, if you really understand, the key to good writing is really understanding something. And I said, well, Tim, I really understand it. I still can't write it. But that process of really understanding something is I think it's part of the work of journalism. I think getting started on stories getting started on a new piece is always scary. I always have that. I'm not a beat reporter. At Vanity Fair, I bounce around and cover everything from the Zumba madam who was in Kennebunkport, who was seducing members of the community as a Zumba madam, to a really in-depth story on Microsoft and its challenges over the years. When I started the Microsoft story, I didn't even actually understand what Microsoft did as a business. I had never covered technology before. I wasn't sure of the difference between Windows, the operating system that makes Microsoft work, and Office, its suite of products like Microsoft Word. I had to learn everything from scratch. And those first phone calls and those first that process of getting started is always scary. But I have learned if you just get started, something will happen. And reporting, and investigative reporting in particular, becomes its own energy. It drives more reporting because you find out other people to talk to, and other things that you have to learn, and other things you have to figure out. So all you have to do is get started. And once you get started, the ball will start rolling, even if it's very slow. When I worked on my Enron book, I would call probably sometimes 10 people a day, 5 or 10 people a day. I was lucky if one person called me back. But over time, if you keep at it, you do get enough that you can go from there. So I think another thing I think about in everything I write is don't be afraid of nuance. You don't actually want cardboard cutout villains. It might seem easier when you're doing an investigative piece to have black and white and to have very clear bad people and very, very clear good people. But I think it would be awfully boring if the characters we covered really did just lack nuance. And I've discovered that in writing about business gone wrong, there is nuance in spades. I think almost every financial crime requires in some ways the complicity of the victim, usually the willingness of all of us to believe in something that after the fact will clearly seem too good to be true, whether it's Enron and its ability to manufacture money, or the financial crisis and the ability to take mortgages made to people who couldn't pay them back and turn them into AAA-rated securities as safe as the debt of the United States itself. It's certainly true of Bernie Madoff's investors, and it's obviously true of Enron. Investors could have done their homework and seen the same warning signs I did, not a fraud, but of a company that was hiding things and things not adding up. They didn't. Why not? They wanted investors and Enron stock to keep going higher. It's this, and even within the company itself, the people inside the company, you would think, well, these just must be really bad guys. But it's often really complicated. It's this interesting mix of self-delusion, incompetence, venality, maybe a little bit of outright corruption, but it's rarely as simple as bad people doing bad things. You only wish, right, if in the financial crisis you could find the leaders of Wall Street firms sitting in the dark, smoky room off Wall Street plotting how they're going to bring down the global financial system, or at Enron if you could find the moment when they decided that they could bankrupt this company, but it usually doesn't work that way. I thought when I started calling people on my Enron book that when I got people to talk to me, I'd be able to say, all right, how'd you do it? How'd you commit the fraud in your division? And they'd say, all right, here's how we did it. And they didn't. Most of the time they didn't know. They'd bought into the corporate culture and they didn't lift their heads to see how the pieces were or weren't coming together. I thought about nuance a lot in my most recent book, Shaky Ground, about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, these two companies which support the majority of our American mortgage market, are really the center of an ideological war. if you break it down in simple terms, on the left, the view of the financial crisis is often Wall Street greed. On the right, the view is that these two companies caused the 2008 financial crisis by making mortgages to people who couldn't afford to pay them back. And it's really almost a religious war, because if you can say that these two companies and government policy were responsible for the financial crisis, then you can say, oh, well, Wall Street didn't do anything wrong. We don't need any new regulation. All we need is to get the government out of everything. So it's really become this religious war. And I tried to write my book from a very nuanced perspective of laying out the problems with these two companies' business model and laying out their political power. Fannie Mae in particular was the most politically powerful company Washington has ever seen, and laying out how dangerous and ugly their political power was, but also being very clear on the analysis that they didn't actually cause the financial crisis. And I think in Nuance lies a better story than in ideology or in reductionism to black and white. So don't be afraid of it. Nuance really can be your friend. I also think another sort of lesson of mine that I try to keep in mind is that a little humility goes a long way. When I was working on my piece about Enron, and I finally called the company up and to confront Jeff Skilling about some of the things I was asking. He was then the company's CEO. He got really upset with me on the phone, and he said, "What you're doing is unethical, because if you really understood the questions you were asking, you wouldn't be asking these questions. You'd know better, and you haven't done your homework well enough to be writing about us." And that's a really scary thing to be told, in part because I think it can be true. Journalism is this game of trying your best to get enough information to be accurate, but you're handicapped by not only by who you call and the sources of information you seek out, and you want to reduce that handicap as much as you can, but you're also handicapped by who will talk to you and what information you can get. And it is always possible that you actually are missing the story. And I think you have to always be aware of that possibility somewhere in your mind. I don't mean to imply that any of us are geniuses, but there's that great quote, it's either Mark Twain or F. Scott Fitzgerald, that the mark of genius is being able to hold two competing ideas in your head and not go mad. And I think you have to hold these competing ideas of belief in your own story in your mind, and belief in the evidence you're marshaling and the things you're learning, but also with this awareness that you just might not be seeing it clearly yet, and you might not be all the way there yet. So when I was finishing up my Enron story, the Enron executives then got on a plane and flew up to New York to confront me. And I had my editors sit in on that meeting, not because they even asked to sit in on the meeting, but because I thought, okay, if I am so invested by this point, in this point of view, that I think something is wrong here, I want somebody else to listen to this, somebody else with a purely independent judgment who can say, am I right, or do they actually have a logical explanation for what's going on here? And I've gotten so invested in my own story that I'm missing the point. And I think if you can find somebody else you trust, whether it's an editor or a colleague, to be that person, I think that's actually really, really helpful. I think a bit of a corollary on this, I read somewhere another investigative journalist saying you should always approach the sources, the people you're talking to or writing about, with animosity, with the sense that these are your enemies. And I don't actually agree with that. I think people, whether they're executives or secretaries, deserve respectful treatment. But there's a real difference between respect for someone's accomplishment and perhaps their earned station in life, and being a sycophant and accepting everything they say as true. So I think you have to find your own balance between respect for people and for the stories they want to tell, and very critical questioning. And it's a really tough balancing act, and I'm still not sure. I think it's something I still struggle to find exactly the right answer to that. So on a final note, I wanted to say that when I finished writing about Enron, I thought, okay, I'm done. I mean, I've had the big financial scandal of my career. This is it. All done. And then came the financial crisis in 2008. And so people often say, well, don't you want to leave business writing and go on to write about something else, politics, global affairs? And I say, oh no, it doesn't get any better than this. I mean, that old adage that anything can happen is more true in business than in practically anything else. It just proves truth is stranger than fiction, time and time again. My first story for Vanity Fair was about self-made technology wizard named Henry Nicholas, who created a company called Broadcom, which was one of Silicon Valley's great stars. And he became one of the wealthiest men in the country. And in 2008, he was indicted for stock options backdating, which you guys are saying, Vanity Fair, stock options backdating. Turned out he was also indicted for essentially running a drug ring, a little more Vanity Fair-like. And then it turns out that he had allegedly built this lair under his house, part of which was a secret from his wife for doing drugs and having sex with prostitutes. Very much Vanity Fair. Anyway, so the last line of my story was a quote from Calvin and Hobbes, which I loved. And Calvin said, "Do you believe in the devil? You know, a supreme evil being dedicated to the temptation, destruction, and corruption of man?" Replies Hobbes, "I'm not sure man needs the help." I learned a secret on this story for sneaking into gated communities, too, by the way, that I'm happy to share. But anyway, you couldn't make up the Bernie Madoff story either. If you'd gone to Hollywood and pitched it, that there's this guy running this enormous management fund and everybody's clamoring to invest with him and it's going to turn out to be a fraud to the tune of $50 billion or whatever the final figure was, people would have said, "Oh, no, that can't be true. That could never happen." And then if you had told them his name, Madoff, they would have said, "No, you're crazy." So a corollary of this is back to my comment about being a skeptic and not a cynic. You know, be careful of established truths as well. Untouchable icons, brilliant people who say somebody else is brilliant, and even other people's reporting. One of the best pieces of journalism I've read lately was the Wall Street Journal's very meticulous takedown of a company called Theranos that was supposedly a company that could revolutionize the process of testing blood. And its young founder, Elizabeth Holmes, who I think became the youngest female billionaire, has gotten nothing but just laudatory stories in the press. She has prominent people on her board. She has Silicon Valley's smartest venture capitalists invested in her company, and it turns out that company was not what it was cracked up to be. So I wanted to close on that note by saying perhaps it is sad, but I don't think that business journalists will ever lack for work. So on that note, any questions?
Has a question, you can come to the mic.
Thank you for your speech. I'll ask one question and sit back down. Recently, you mentioned the Wall Street Journal expose on that company, and then you also have the New York Times and Amazon having somewhat of a public sparring match.
Yep.
Over a recent story. Do you see companies becoming a little more assertive when faced off with journalists or going to different news outlets or medium.com?
Yep.
Is that a new trend or has that always been a trend?
I think companies have always been very aggressive, but perhaps in a slightly different way. So the way Enron was aggressive with me was that I was never allowed access to an Enron executive again after my critical story. Ken Lay would talk to, who became the CEO of Enron, would talk to everybody, but he wouldn't talk to me. And that's a really frightening thing if you're a beat reporter whose job depends on access to executives, to be told that if you write anything critical, you won't be given access to the company anymore. And companies have always been aggressive in that way, and they've always been aggressive in hiring very highly paid PR people and putting together gorgeous presentations that lay out what they do. I think that's why it's so important to make sure whatever you're working on that you do independent reporting. I started my Enron story by doing independent reporting such that by the time I got to the company, I had enough of my own information that I didn't just get swayed by their apparent prowess and slick presentations. I do think companies using social media as a way to rebut what a journalist says is a new phenomenon. It's a different way of being aggressive, but it's just a different form of the same behavior. So you're not gonna make friends if you take on companies. I sometimes wonder how I ended up in this situation because I actually like being liked, and it's nice if you write a nice story about a company. The CEO sometimes calls you and says "good job," and it feels good on some level. Except I've gotten to the stage now where it actually doesn't feel so good.
Hey Bethany, great talk. Appreciate your work. What's the secret for sneaking into gated communities?
So I figured out that if you go in a black car that looks extremely official and you duck in the back, that they'll often just let the black car in the gate. At least it worked for me. So it was a limousine in particular. Anyone else? I see a hand back there.
Hi, thank you for being here. I was just curious, when the Enron executives did come to your office and confronted you, and when you had that conversation and they said you don't know enough, at what point did you feel confident that you did have enough to go forward with the story?
I'm not sure I ever did, and I think it might be a facet of my personality. I lack that ability to be totally confident. I am always terrified before something goes to press, that I've missed something, that I've made a mistake, that I'm not right. And so for me, this whole thing is extremely stressful. I don't think I ever get to the point where I feel 100% confident. What I try to do is remind myself by going through my facts and my reporting and my logic that I can't see anything else it could be, and I can't see an I haven't dotted or a T I haven't crossed or a number that's incorrect or a sentence that's wrong or misleading. But I never achieve 100% confidence.
Can you talk more about what happens as a beat reporter when you do write the story that then gets you kind of locked out of the good graces of your sources?
Yeah, I don't luckily have to deal with that issue because I've never been a beat reporter, and that's a freedom of being a magazine writer. The downside of that is that you're starting every story from scratch. The upside is that you can offend people you've spoken to, or take the risk of them not liking what you've written because you don't need to go back to them. I think that's a unique, hard thing for beat reporters to have to navigate, and I think companies do use that power aggressively. So it's a function of my career that it's not something I've had to navigate. And I always think it's just never worth it. I mean, the only thing you can do is write the truth as you see it. You might be wrong, and you might get some things wrong, but if that's how you see it and that's how you call it, then that's what you do. And that's the one thing you can always hold fast to, no matter what the pressure coming at you or the pressure to be liked. If you ever don't write the truth as you perceive it, that's when you've sort of lost your way.
So you describe journalism as this game where you have these two different handcuffs. You have the sources that you find, and you have the sources who are actually willing to talk to you.
Yep.
Can you, not to put you on the spot, can you talk about a few instances in which it was a source that you didn't think you'd be able to get them to talk to you, and like a success, and also maybe something that kind of fell through?
Yep. So without being specific about people, and it is a whole topic of conversation and debate, one of the things about business journalism is that you often do have to rely on background sources, and I know background sources are very people question them a lot today, but you have to, because in the business world, nobody has any incentive to say anything negative on the record, and if you have to rely on what people are going to tell you on the record, you're never going to get at the truth of things. So that's one thing. I have generally a rule that people are either inclined to talk or they're not, and it's not often that repeated pursuit of someone who is not inclined to talk yields anything. I'm going to get to the exception for that, but I think the best way you do it is by calling everybody you can think of, and there will be enough people who are inclined to talk and who want to tell their story. The one thing that has worked for me is going back to people after I know more and saying, okay, you didn't want to talk, but now I've got X, Y, and Z, and this is the direction I'm heading, and do you want to talk now? And that's the one place where I've had luck in circling back to people. There was one major figure in the financial crisis who had been the number 2 at an important company who wouldn't talk to me and wouldn't talk to me and wouldn't talk to me. And finally, the month before the book was published, he agreed to talk. And I ended up rewriting the entire chapter that dealt with his company because it was so important. But he said no to me for a year and a half. But finally, when I knew enough and when sort of the do or die moment was approaching, so you do always circle back to people who are critical. But I think most people are either in the inclined to talk or not inclined to talk category, and you also have to cut your losses with those who won't talk. Yeah.
I'm using Dean's privilege here. 2/3 of our students are women, and I'm wondering are there any particular strengths or challenges that women journalists face if they're covering business and finance, which is largely a male world, especially, the commanding heights of business is very male and a very masculine world?
Yeah, I think about that differently. It's a really tough and interesting question. I've always thought that a lot of the time it doesn't matter. With Enron, I think they would have been aggressive with me if I were male, purple, bald, spiky-headed. I don't think it mattered. They didn't like skepticism. It didn't particularly matter that it was coming from a woman. I think sometimes being female can work to your disadvantage because you're not taken seriously. I think sometimes it can work to your advantage and so it's a mixture. It's like any other trait you might have, like a man being big and tall with a deep, powerful voice can sometimes be an advantage, and it can sometimes be a disadvantage. One of the things I try to think about is that if people insult me and don't take me seriously and aren't nice to me, I don't have to care. And it's a real luxury of being a journalist if you can get your own ego out of the way, that sometimes it's actually better if people don't think very much of you and don't think you're dangerous, because you don't have to care what they think of you. It's kind of unlike being a mid-level female manager where you have to get the people around you to take you seriously and you have to learn how to present. Or I think about my sister who's a doctor and who has to talk to parents about their dying children, and she has to have force and presence and be able to make these parents feel better. You don't need that as a journalist. If people are completely dismissive of you, so what? As long as you're getting the information you need and you're able to ask the questions you want, why does it matter if you can just get your own ego out of the way? That said, it is interesting. I was recently at this dinner and I was seated next to, and it was a small exclusive dinner, and I was seated next to a prominent venture capitalist, and he said when I sat down, he said, "Oh, are you part of the event staff?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm actually a writer for the magazine." And then he proceeded to explain to me the difference between investors and CEOs. He said, "Those people over there, they're CEOs. They run companies. That means they have people work for them. I'm an investor. I put money into companies." And I thought, what is this? And I could tell you millions more of those type of stories. But I tried to think in that, it wasn't fun, but I tried to think in that situation, do I have to care? Does it really matter? And I thought, no, it actually doesn't really matter. And so I think that's, if you keep your eye on the main goal, which is getting people's stories, getting information, I think it helps to put some of your ego aside sometimes about whether you're treated well or not.
Thank you so much for coming in, and also for telling us about your own personal insecurities with things. I think that sometimes we don't hear enough about that, so I really appreciate that you shared that with us as well. A question that I had is, how do you know when you've reached the critical mass that you really have the story? Because it seems like you could continue reporting forever and ever with a lot of things, especially in the Enron case.
And it's so much easier to continue reporting than it is to sit down and write, right? Yeah, I think you know when you've reached critical mass when you know what people are going to say before they say it, and when you start hearing the same thing from everybody, or when there's nothing that people can say that strikes you as new or that gives you that feeling of, oh, I didn't understand that yet. I didn't know that. I think that's when you start to feel like you've got enough. And when your own gaps in logic, the how you get from A to B to C, they're answered, you know how you get from A to B, and you understand it. And I think all of that kind of comes together, and you feel like you've answered your own questions. And then I think you know that you're there. But even then, I think when you in the final stages, you're gonna learn new things, and you're gonna find new things out. I don't know that a work of journalism is ever 100% complete.
So you seem like a very organized and thorough person, like looking at everything. So what I wanted to know is, how do you put it all together? Like, you do so much reporting for a story. Even this book would have reporting over a year and a half. So how do you actually organize all the stuff which you write, and how do you finally synthesize and put it all together?
So the way I organize, I have a Gmail account, and I think Gmail has been the best thing in the world for me because I do folders, and I put everything that pertains to a certain topic in an email folder with that label. So it might be an email from somebody. It might, if I find a great document online, I might email myself the document and make sure that's in the folder. And so I create these folders either around topics, if it's a long story, around chapters once I figured that out for a book, and then when I'm working on that chapter or that thing, I go through everything and I make sure I've looked at everything, and I create this giant note file that just has sort of everything in it. And then I try to think through what my story where the story is, and then I sort of start chipping away at the information to think, okay, what's really relevant to this story I'm telling? What's really important and what isn't? What can go by the wayside? Somebody said to me once, which I loved, that facts are like lights on a Christmas tree. You actually can't have too many, and that was a very good lesson to me because I never met a fact I didn't like, and so I would just load my stories up with so much information that they were just these dense globs. So that's one thing, that you have to figure out what's really germane to your story, and part of that is letting go of being a good student. And what I mean by that is that you're not trying to, when you write a story, you're not trying to show your reader that you know of everything and you've thought of every single angle and you can answer any criticism people might have or any question people might have ahead of time. You're trying to tell a story that you've arrived at. This is the story after all of your reporting, and some things you've learned actually have to fall out of the piece. And so I try to remember that what you let go of is as important as what you write. But I don't think it's easy. I mean, if anybody had mastered the sort of perfect art of organizing and writing, then they'd tell you, here's how you do it. It's A, B, C, D, and then you've got your story structure. And it's not. You keep going until it feels like it's starting to feel right, and it's got that gravitational pull toward it.
Me again. Did you ever regret reporting something?
Ever regret reporting something? No, I've had stories that haven't panned out and things that haven't been what I thought they were, but I've met interesting people along the way and had great conversations and learned more about somebody or learned more about some aspect of the world. So I don't think I've regretted stories I've ended up writing because I don't think in retrospect they've been right. But I don't think I've regretted the process of doing them. I think I've just regretted that I didn't see it more clearly at the time. But I always, journalism is one of the, if you're a curious person, it's really hard to think of anything better than journalism, for the opportunity to pick up the phone, call just about anybody, ask questions, satisfy your curiosity, meet people that you would never otherwise meet across a broad range of really fascinating areas. I mean, there's just nothing like it. It makes the world a continuously bigger place. So I don't think I've never regretted learning something, but I have regretted not seeing the story clearly enough when I've done it.
Thank you, Bethany. That was a fabulous lecture. There were so many. I saw a lot of people here taking notes. I think they're taking notes, not doing Facebook. But lots of takeaways here. I particularly like the one about questioning established truths, revered icons, and questioning the work of other journalists. I like the Christmas tree metaphor as well. That's fantastic. I always remember that and share with our students. Thank you so much for this fabulous lecture. We're very fortunate that you joined us tonight.